Who else was looking down the line when you look at the talent roster? Who else possibly could Undertaker work with? And
in the shadowy corners of professional wrestling, there's one name that stirs more debate than any other: Vince McMahon. A man who built a billion-dollar empire from steel chairs, storylines, and broken alliances. But beyond the bright lights and roaring arenas, it's the real backstage stories that pack the biggest punches. And when Vince, now 79, finally decided to speak out, really speak, he didn't hold back. With decades of grudges, creative clashes, and personal tensions buried deep, he named names, one by one. Wrestlers who, in his own words, he just couldn't stand. You might think you know the full story, but this is where it takes a turn. He opened the floodgates with a jaw-dropper: John Cena. Yes, the same John Cena who became the face of WWE for over 10 years, beloved by millions, mocked by millions more, but always impossible to ignore. To Vince, however, the first impression was anything but love. Cena, fresh-faced and jacked like a comic book hero, showed up with swagger and spark. But to Vince, he saw danger. "Get that walking billboard out of my sight," he reportedly said. Still burned from the early 90s steroid trial that nearly ruined everything, Vince saw in Cena not a savior, but a potential PR disaster. Ironically, it was the same man he tried to bury that became the pillar of his empire. Sometimes, the thing you fear the most is what saves you in the end. And then came Randy Orton. Wrestling royalty, third-generation blood, but a red flag in Vince's eyes. Why? Randy's controversial past in the military. Vince, who wears patriotism like armor, was instantly wary. He didn't want someone who walked away from service to represent his brand. It was Jim Ross who pleaded Randy's case, insisting legacy and potential were worth the gamble. Vince reluctantly agreed. But their clashes didn't stop there. Years later, at a global event in Saudi Arabia, Randy asked to make his entrance riding a camel like his tag partner, Matt Riddle. Vince said no. No explanation, no room for debate, just, "Your character wouldn't ride a camel." That's the kind of control Vince lived for, the kind that often silenced even the biggest stars. Then there was The Undertaker, Mark Calloway, a legend, an icon, and one of the most respected men in the business. But would you believe Vince once wanted nothing to do with him? When Mark was grinding it out as Mean Mark Callis in WCW, someone brought him to Vince's attention. Vince took one look and dismissed him. "Looks like a basketball player," he muttered. That could have been the end. But fate and persistence had other plans. Mark fought through pain, literally wrestling on a dislocated hip to prove himself. Even after becoming The Undertaker, their relationship was laced with tension. At WrestleMania 8, Mark went slightly off script in a match finish. It was a minor detail to fans, but to Vince, it was treason. He erupted backstage, and in that moment, the dead man learned an eternal truth. In Vince's world, even legends enter Stone Cold Steve Austin, the anti-hero who turned rebellion into ratings gold. But Vince, he saw a problem before he saw a star. When Steve arrived in WWE as the ringmaster, Vince pegged him as mid-card material. It took a push from Jake the Snake Roberts to convince him otherwise. But as Steve's star rose, so did Vince's discomfort. Steve broke every mold. Beer, profanity, flipping the bird. He was everything Vince tried to suppress in a family-friendly product. Their on-screen rivalry became iconic, culminating in the infamous segment where Steve held Vince hostage with a toy gun, prompting Vince to, well, have a very public accident on live TV. But backstage, the chaos was real. Steve went off script, cost the company thousands in overtime, and played by his own rules. Vince hated the unpredictability, but couldn't deny the magnetism. And then there's Chris Jericho, a man who redefined charisma and ring psychology. But to Vince, he was simply too short. That's it. Too short. Jim Ross had to all but beg Vince to take Jericho seriously, pointing out his success in ECW and WCW, his mic skills, and his connection with fans. But Vince couldn't get past the image. In his mind, wrestling heroes had to tower. Jericho didn't fit the blueprint. So much so that Chris started wearing lifts in his boots just to appear taller backstage. And then came the second strike, his nationality. Vince wasn't keen on a Canadian babyface leading the charge. To him, Canadians made better villains. Yes, really. But Chris kept climbing, kept proving himself. No matter how many times Vince tried to sideline him, the fans wouldn't let go. These weren't just creative disagreements. They were battles for identity, legacy, and power. Vince McMahon didn't just run a wrestling company. He built a kingdom where loyalty was tested. Characters were controlled, and even the brightest stars had to earn their light. On his terms. What makes this list so shocking isn't just the names on it, but the realization that many of Vince's biggest stars were also his biggest gambles. And the stories behind them? That's where the real show begins. The truth is, Vince didn't just shape WWE, he shaped people. Wrestlers walked in thinking they'd be legends, only to find themselves fighting for approval, dodging landmines, and adapting to rules that could change on a whim. And yet, in the chaos, some rose above. Despite the odds, despite the friction, despite Vince's vision, they became unforgettable. He was the kind of performer who could light up an arena just by running down the ramp. But behind the curtain, things were falling apart. Vince McMahon had once placed all his bets on Ultimate Warrior, believing his wild charisma and superhuman physique could carry WWE into a new era. But that belief was shaken the moment Warrior began demanding more than just a spotlight. He wanted the kind of money reserved for legends like Hogan, and he wasn't subtle about it. At one point, he even threatened to no-show a major event unless Vince gave in. That moment burned deep into Vince's memory, and from that day forward, trust between them became fragile. Warrior was electric, but Vince couldn't forget how easily he turned business into a battleground. Years later, when Warrior finally returned to WWE, the tension hadn't entirely faded. Yes, there was applause. Yes, there were tributes, but you could still feel the scars. Vince tried to rewrite their legacy with Hall of Fame speeches and nostalgia packages, but those who remembered the chaos behind the curtain knew the truth. Warrior was a symbol of both the company's grandeur and its deepest fractures. And just when fans thought they'd seen the last of the unexpected, there was CM Punk. Charismatic, articulate, defiant, Punk wasn't just another superstar. He was the voice of every fan who ever questioned the system. Vince McMahon should have loved him, but instead, they clashed like fire and oil. Punk didn't play by the rules. He spoke his mind, aired his grievances on live television, and called out everyone from Triple H to the entire corporate machine. Vince respected passion, but not when it challenged his grip on control. The famous pipe bomb in 2011 wasn't just a promo. It was a declaration of war. Punk spoke the unspeakable, saying out loud what many whispered backstage. And when the crowd erupted, Vince realized something he never expected. Punk had just turned rebellion into ratings gold. But even success couldn't fix their broken connection. Punk was exhausted. He felt creatively stifled, physically worn out, and emotionally betrayed. When he finally walked out in 2014, he didn't just leave the company. He vanished from an industry that had once worshipped him. Years later, he returned to wrestling, but never to Vince. That door, once slammed, remained shut. In the echo of Punk's departure came a quieter, subtler tension. This time with one of Vince's most loyal soldiers, Daniel Bryan. Small, scrappy, and full of heart, Bryan was never supposed to be the face of WWE, at least not in Vince's eyes. To him, Bryan was too ordinary, too soft-spoken, too vanilla. But fans saw something different. They saw a fighter. And when the crowd hijacked shows, chanting Bryan's name, Vince had no choice but to listen. Yet even then, he resisted. Storylines were rewritten, matches delayed, momentum stalled. It wasn't until fans forced the moment that Vince reluctantly pulled the trigger. Bryan won the WWE Championship at WrestleMania 30 in what is now remembered as one of the most emotional moments in wrestling history. But behind that moment was years of tension. Bryan had to fight not just opponents, but the system itself. And while Vince smiled in front of the cameras, backstage the old doubts still lingered. Bryan's later departure to AEW wasn't explosive, but it was telling. Quietly, he walked away, not with anger, but with the knowledge that even victory came at a cost. Then there was the silent storm, China, a trailblazer, a phenomenon, the ninth wonder of the world. China shattered every mold, redefined what women in wrestling could be, and stood toe-to-toe with the men. She held titles, headlined shows, and inspired millions. But for all her accomplishments, Vince McMahon didn't treat her like a lasting icon. After her personal relationship with Triple H ended, her role in WWE began to fade. Suddenly, she was gone, without a grand farewell, without a statue, without even a proper thank you. Years later, when fans begged for her Hall of Fame induction, Vince hesitated. He cited reasons, avoided specifics, and deflected with business jargon. But fans knew. China wasn't being kept out because of her legacy. She was being forgotten because of politics. When she finally was inducted, posthumously, the applause was deafening. But it couldn't erase the years she'd been left in the shadows. Just when the fans thought it couldn't get more complicated, there was Cody Rhodes. The son of the legendary Dusty Rhodes, Cody grew up in wrestling royalty. But inside WWE, he was never treated like it. Given goofy gimmicks and stuck in mid-card matches, Cody's frustration grew. He pitched ideas, begged for creative freedom, but was constantly told no. Vince didn't see him as a main event player. So Cody did something unthinkable. He walked away. He left the biggest wrestling company in the world and built something of his own. From indie promotions to co-founding AEW, Cody proved that he didn't need Vince's permission to be a star. And then, in a twist worthy of a Hollywood script, Cody returned. Older, wiser, and with the crowd fully behind him. This time, Vince had to take him seriously. The very man he once underestimated was now headlining WrestleMania. It was the kind of full-circle moment wrestling dreams are made of. But it also exposed a truth Vince rarely admitted. Sometimes, the ones who walk away shine brightest when they return. Through all these stories, each one more dramatic than the last, a pattern emerges. Vince McMahon, for all his genius and vision, often stood in the way of the very stars who made his empire shine. Whether it was because of ego, misjudgment, or stubbornness, he underestimated the hearts of fighters and the will of rebels. The curtain was already fraying, but what happened next set everything ablaze behind the scenes. Warrior, once seen as a force of nature in the ring, began making choices that risked the entire empire Vince had built. Growth enhancers entered the picture, and with them, a suspension that sent shockwaves through the locker room. At a time when WWE was already battling public scrutiny due to steroid trials, Warrior's decisions felt like a ticking clock on Vince's legacy. The final straw came in 1992 when Warrior failed a critical drug screening. That wasn't just a breach of policy, it was a breach of trust. Vince looked at Warrior and saw not a champion, but a liability. The wild charisma, the face paint, the intensity, none of it could mask the chaos behind the curtain. To Vince, Warrior wasn't unpredictable in a good way. He was a storm waiting to hit. But if Warrior's flame burned too hot, Jeff Jarrett's was doused by ego and money. There was a time when Vince genuinely saw Jeff as a future main eventer. His look, his timing, his legacy. Jarrett had it all. But everything began to fall apart during a tense standoff that turned personal. As Jeff's WWE contract neared its expiration, he demanded a payout before wrestling his final match against China. Vince, known for his calculated control, viewed it as extortion. The match went on, but Vince never forgot. That moment defined how Vince saw Jeff from then on, not as a star, but as someone who cornered him when he was most vulnerable. Even years later, when Hall of Fame conversations came up, Vince's answer was cold and definitive. Absolutely not. Jeff went on to forge his own legacy outside of WWE, but to Vince, betrayal echoed louder than any championship belt. Then came the one twist no one expected. Shane McMahon, Vince's own flesh and blood, became part of this broken trust. Most fathers and sons argue, but for Vince and Shane, the battleground was WWE itself. Shane had bold ideas, futuristic visions, even pitches to buy the then flailing UFC. But Vince didn't see genius. He saw naivete. "Use your own money," he told Shane, with a smirk that stung harder than a chair shot. But when Shane's booking of the 2022 Royal Rumble spiraled into chaos, Vince didn't hesitate. He pulled the plug, fired his own son. It was more than business. It was a statement. No one, not even blood, is bigger than WWE. Paul Heyman once described a moment so tense it bordered on theatrical. Vince handing Shane a knife and challenging him to push through his vision. That wasn't just rejection. That was Vince saying, "You're not cut from the cloth I built." The silence that followed was broken by Ryback. A storm of muscle, controversy, and raw ambition. When Ryback debuted in 2012, many thought he'd be Vince's next Goldberg. But the honeymoon was short-lived. Ryback's personality clashed hard with WWE's rigid structure. He spoke out. He challenged creative. He demanded to be heard. Vince doesn't hate confidence. He despises defiance. When Ryback took legal action to gain rights to his own ring name, it struck a nerve. To Vince, it was ungrateful. WWE made Ryback, and now Ryback wanted to rewrite the script. Things got uglier when Ryback launched into a series of personal tirades on social media, even crossing emotional boundaries by dragging Vince's family into it. Though he apologized later, the fallout was irreversible. To Vince, Ryback wasn't just rebellious, he was dangerous to the image of the company. But no chapter hits harder than the saga of CM Punk. From the moment Punk entered WWE, he was a firebrand, a renegade, a disruptor, and Vince saw him as a threat to the foundation he'd laid. Punk didn't want to play ball, he wanted to tear down the stadium. He spoke with venomous truth, calling himself the voice of the voiceless. And it wasn't just a slogan, it was a battle cry. Punk demanded freedom, more money, and creative power. Vince refused. Punk didn't bend. He clashed with everyone, backstage staff, creative heads, top brass, and his frustration boiled over in public interviews. He questioned the very machine that made him a household name. That was the red line. Vince could tolerate chaos if it stayed behind closed doors, but Punk aired it out for the world to see. In the end, their split wasn't just professional, it was personal, and it left a scar that still lingers in WWE lore. Of all these tales, CM Punk's financial trajectory offers the most captivating look into what happens when rebellion meets business. Punk's net worth today is estimated around $12 million, built not only on wrestling but on savvy brand decisions. He owns a collection of high-performance vehicles, including a customized Dodge Challenger SRT Demon and a sleek matte black Tesla Model S. His taste in luxury watches leans toward Rolex and Omega, with a fondness for the Speedmaster series. Real estate-wise, he has invested in upscale properties in Chicago, notably a modern loft featuring minimalist architecture and a private gym. Punk never splurged on a private jet, preferring commercial travel or rentals, which fits his everyman brand. He's backed comic book projects, podcast ventures, and even made moves into MMA with the UFC. His insurance choices have reportedly included career protection clauses and health coverage tailored to athletes, ensuring he remained financially secure even during downtime. The lesson? Punk's career shows that even when you reject the system, financial success comes from knowing your brand, staying true to your identity, and diversifying early. Looking back, every one of these stars represents a different kind of fracture in Vince McMahon's empire. Some broke rules, some broke contracts, and some broke his trust. But they all left behind stories that still echo in the halls of wrestling history. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Was it the betrayal, the business drama, or the unspoken wounds that will likely never heal? Hit that like button if this gave you chills, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the hidden corners of Hollywood and beyond.